Only minutes ago, new attention turned back to the federal investigation into Elaine Whitfield, and the focus is once again on her home. What investigators found inside was not dramatic, but it was deeply unsettling. No broken doors, no signs of chaos, just quiet details that did not feel right, details that made the FBI return, look again, and then grow silent. When federal agents stop talking, it usually means something has been uncovered, something that changes the whole case. What exactly did they find inside Elaine Whitfield's home that made everything shift? Stay with us, because before this is over, you'll understand why the silence itself became the loudest piece of evidence in the entire investigation. The story of Elaine Whitfield begins in a way that feels almost deliberately ordinary, which is exactly what makes it so hard to sit with now. Nothing about that final evening stood out. No raised voices, no slammed doors, no warning signs anyone could point back to later and say, that's when it started going wrong. It was, by every account gathered afterward, a night like 100 nights before it. Elaine spent the evening with her family in the small house she'd lived in for almost a decade, on a quiet street where neighbors still waved from their porches. They ate dinner together. Her teenage nephew, who was staying with her that week, later told investigators they'd watched part of a movie and argued lightly over whether to finish it. There was laughter. There was the ordinary hum of a household winding down for the night. Nobody remembers a disagreement. Nobody remembers her sounding afraid, or distracted, or like a person carrying a secret. That detail matters more than it seems to. In cases like this, investigators don't just look for signs of danger. They look for the absence of them, because a person about to vanish under threat often, even unconsciously, telegraphs something. A change in tone. A held breath. Elaine gave them nothing to hold on to. Whatever happened to her, it did not announce itself in advance. She was dropped off at her house sometime before 10 that night. A detail law enforcement has confirmed but has been notably tight-lipped about, particularly regarding who did the dropping off. That omission alone tells you something. In investigations of this nature, every detail is scrutinized, and when officials choose not to share one, it is rarely because it doesn't matter. It's because it matters too much. By all appearances, everything was normal once she was home. She didn't call anyone for help. There were no strange sounds reported by neighbors, no lights flicking on and off at odd hours, nothing that would have made anyone think to look twice. The night simply passed, the way nights do. And then morning came, and Elaine was gone. When investigators first entered the house, they were hoping the scene itself would hand them an explanation. Instead, it handed them more questions. There was no forced entry, no broken window, no splintered door frame, no sign that anyone had come in against her will. The stillness of the house, rather than offering comfort, unsettled everyone who walked through it. In most disappearances, investigators can read a room the way a detective reads a face: a knocked-over lamp, a torn curtain, scuff marks on a floor. Elaine's house offered none of that, and the absence of evidence, counterintuitively, didn't calm anyone down. It sharpened their concern. When someone disappears from inside their own home without a single sign of struggle, investigators are forced to consider possibilities that are, in some ways, more disturbing than a break-in. That she left with someone she trusted, that she left on her own accord, or that whoever was involved knew her routines well enough to move through her house without disturbing a single thing. That kind of quiet often points to intimacy rather than violence, familiarity rather than force. It suggests a scene that was either carefully avoided or carefully arranged, and figuring out which one it was became the entire shape of the early investigation. Within days, what had been treated as a local missing person case was reclassified. Federal investigators stepped in, and that shift alone told residents of the small town that this was no longer just a family emergency. It was something with wider implications, something involving patterns of behavior, communication, or conduct that reached beyond one house on one quiet street. Agents moved through Elaine's home with methodical care, cataloging belongings, photographing rooms, documenting the placement of even the smallest items. Then, in a move that raised eyebrows among people familiar with how these cases usually unfold, the scene was released, cleared, handed back, and then, days later, reopened. A second visit to a home that had already been processed is unusual. It typically only happens when new information forces investigators to reconsider what they thought they already understood. The timeline itself became one of the case's central puzzles. Elaine did not fade from her ordinary routine gradually. She was there, and then she wasn't, within a window investigators have never fully detailed publicly. That narrowness matters. It suggests either extraordinary precision on the part of whoever was involved, or that Elaine left under circumstances that, in the moment, did not register to her as dangerous. Quietly, investigators have reportedly been weighing the possibility that she left on her own, a scenario that, if true, reshapes nearly everything else about the case. It changes how evidence is read, which leads get prioritized, which questions rise to the top of the list. If she wasn't taken, then the absence of forced entry stops being strange and starts being expected. But if she was taken, that same absence becomes one of the most chilling details in the entire file. People who knew Elaine describe her as careful, someone who checked her locks twice, who didn't ignore her instincts, who avoided situations that felt even slightly off. That's part of what makes this so hard for the people close to her to accept. Her disappearance doesn't fit the pattern of the life she built. It contradicts almost everything people believe they knew about how she moved through the world. What remains, more than anything, is a kind of silence that has settled over the case itself, a stillness that mirrors the stillness investigators found in her house that first morning. And as we'll get into, that silence turned out to be one of the most important clues of all. Federal involvement in a missing person case rarely happens without cause, and it almost never happens this early unless investigators believe there's more going on beneath the surface than a simple disappearance. With Elaine's case, that shift happened fast, and it changed how everyone, from local police to the public, had to think about what they were looking at. On its face, the case had started out looking almost peaceful. A missing person report, a quiet house, no signs of violence, no witnesses to anything alarming. But experienced investigators know that calm can be deceptive. Sometimes it means nothing happened. Sometimes it means something happened so carefully that it left no trace at all. Federal agencies don't typically step into local cases just because uncertainty exists. They step in when the nature of that uncertainty starts to look organized rather than random. A disappearance with no forced entry, no struggle, and a tight, specific time frame reads differently to trained investigators than it does to the public. It suggests planning. It suggests intention. And those are the kinds of details federal agents are trained to notice quickly. The timing of Elaine's disappearance played a significant role in how seriously it was taken. She was confirmed safe the night before. By morning, she was gone. That narrow window immediately raised concern, because it implied one of two things: that whoever was involved knew exactly when to act, or that Elaine left willingly in a moment that, at the time, felt safe rather than threatening. Both possibilities are unsettling in their own way, and both required a level of scrutiny local resources alone weren't equipped to provide. There was also the matter of communication. Once messages believed to be connected to the case began circulating, messages that referenced money, that used language suggesting demands, the case crossed into federal jurisdiction almost automatically. Anything that involves communication across state lines, or that appears to follow a deliberate pattern, stops being a local matter and becomes something federal agencies are equipped and required to handle. After that shift, the public flow of information changed noticeably. Updates slowed. Details that once came fairly freely became sparse, then nearly non-existent. That change wasn't an oversight. It was a decision. When investigators suspect they are dealing with an active, evolving situation, particularly one involving possible demands, they become far more careful about what they release, because too much information in the wrong hands can compromise everything they are working toward. The FBI didn't simply offer resources and step back, either. Agents stayed embedded with local law enforcement, working the scene alongside them, moving through Elaine's home methodically. They weren't looking for a single dramatic discovery. They were looking for deviations. Every home tells the story of how a person actually lives, and investigators have to understand that ordinary rhythm before they can spot what's out of place inside it. They check the obvious things first: locks, windows, points of entry, but the real work happened in the details most people wouldn't think to notice. The position of a lamp, whether a phone was left charging, whether shoes were still by the door. Small, unremarkable-looking things that, taken together, can tell investigators whether someone left in a hurry, was taken without warning, or never intended to leave at all. In Elaine's case, there was no single piece of evidence that cracked the investigation wide open. Instead, there was a pattern, a consistent, quiet strangeness across dozens of small details, none dramatic on their own, all of them slightly, persistently wrong. That kind of stillness unsettles investigators more than chaos does, because chaos tells a story. Silence makes you build one from fragments. Every item removed from the house was documented with extraordinary care, photographed, catalogued, prioritized, because federal protocol treats a scene like this as something to be processed only once. Which is exactly why the second visit stood out so much. Returning to a home that had already been cleared isn't procedure. It's a response to something. And in Elaine's case, that something appears to have come from a source nobody expected. The second visit to Elaine's home happened quietly, without fanfare, without press vans lining the street or officials making statements to cameras. Agents came back without announcing why, and that decision, to move without explanation, tells its own kind of story. In situations like this, silence isn't about withholding for the sake of secrecy. It's about protecting something fragile, something that could unravel if handled carelessly in public view. There were no signs of a full forensic sweep this time. No hazmat-style protective gear, no evidence tents, no urgency that suggested a crime scene reaction to something newly discovered. That absence is telling in itself. It suggests investigators weren't responding to a sudden shocking find. They were confirming something that had already begun to take shape in their minds. They were double-checking measurements, rephotographing rooms they'd already documented, collecting small items that hadn't seemed significant the first time around, but had since become relevant in light of new information. This kind of visit is rarely loud, and it's rarely fast. It's deliberate. Evidence doesn't always arrive with sirens attached. Sometimes it's the placement of an object, the layout of a room, or the specific absence of something that once sat in a particular spot. Context, in cases like this, often matters more than the objects themselves. Rather than chasing the ransom-adjacent messages first, investigators reportedly turned inward, toward behavioral patterns and digital activity. In modern missing person cases, a phone's history can say more than an entire room full of physical evidence. Investigators don't just seize devices, they reconstruct timelines from them. When was the phone last used? Were messages read? Did location data stop cleanly, or did it keep moving after the point where Elaine was last confirmed to be home? Home routers, smart home devices, even simple things like a thermostat schedule, all of it becomes part of the picture. These systems log activity without editorializing. They don't remember selectively or shape a story to make themselves look better in hindsight. They simply record what happened and when, and that kind of unbiased data can move an investigation forward faster than almost anything else available to modern law enforcement. As investigators moved into ransom-related evidence, caution became even more central to their process. They looked for signs of premeditation, whether behavior in the days before the disappearance showed deviation from routine, whether devices had been deliberately positioned, whether the messages that followed showed the fingerprints of planning or the fingerprints of panic. Every detail, no matter how minor, was treated as a potential thread that could unravel the larger picture if pulled correctly. At a certain point in almost every serious investigation, the flow of new public information slows to a trickle and then stops altogether. That doesn't mean the case has gone cold. Often, it means the opposite, that too much is happening at once, and every word released publicly carries the risk of compromising it. That shift happened clearly in Elaine's case. Updates that had once come with some regularity